People used to lump all East Asians together, but thankfully, more and more people these days are learning about how different Chinese, Japanese, and Korean cultures are from each other, which is great. But what a lot of people might not know yet though, is that there can be just as much diversity even within each one of these groups. I'm ethnically Han Chinese, I speak Mandarin, and someone who might not know any better might just take that at face value and assume I'm basically the same as someone from mainland China, for example, which is not the case. Because beyond what's on the surface, it's very likely that we're worlds apart in the way we approach just about everything, since there can be so much cultural variation between the different Chinese communities. And so today, I thought it'd be fun to break down those archetypes by ranking them in a tier list. Now, I might upset some people with some of the things I'll be saying in this video, so before we get into it, I just want to make one thing clear. I know that most of us are just chill, regular-ass people with a lot more in common than we think. That being said, certain traits are just more prevalent in some communities than others simply because of differences in culture. And talking about that is basically what my channel's all about. Alright, without further ado, let's get into it. Starting off with my people, Chinese-Malaysians. Now, a bit of history as to how Malaysia ended up having such a big Chinese population. The biggest wave of Chinese migration came in the 1800s when Malaysia became a British colony, and this migration continued through the early 1900s. The British needed people to work in the tin mines and rubber plantations, but they couldn't get the native Malays to do it because they were happy to just stay in their villages and fish and farm on their own land, and rightfully so. So the British brought in workers from other places like southern China and southern India. Southern China was a terrible place to live in at the time, so a lot of people were happy to just start over in Malaysia. Because even though the working conditions were extremely bad, at least you were guaranteed a job, and you didn't have to live through a war or an uprising every few years. After Malaysia gained independence from the British in 1957, the government allowed Chinese Malaysians to preserve our culture and our language through publicly funded Chinese schools. And this is actually very significant when you take into account that neighboring countries like Thailand and especially Indonesia banned Chinese education outright. In fact, Malaysia is the only country outside of China and Taiwan that has a comprehensive Chinese education system, even though Chinese Malaysians only make up 20% of the population. Because of that, we've been able to preserve Chinese traditions and languages better than people in China. But what makes Chinese Malaysians so unique is that on top of that, we're also extremely open-minded and curious about other cultures. And I feel like this is really worth mentioning because most Chinese communities tend to be very insular. Because Malaysia is one of the world's truest melting pots, Chinese Malaysians grew up getting exposed to multiple languages like Malay, English, Mandarin, Cantonese, Hokkien, Hakka, Tamil, pretty much every day. You could eat out at a kopitiam, a mamak, or a hawker center and end up with Malay, Chinese, and Indian dishes on your table all at the same time. It's very normal to have mixed friend groups and make fun of each other with stereotypes. Point is, that constant exposure to different cultures naturally makes us more interested in people from different backgrounds, no matter where they come from. And I feel like that's one big reason why everyone feels so welcome when they visit Malaysia. Malaysians are also very easygoing in general. The spirit of competition, the rat race, whatever you want to call it, isn't something that's really ingrained into the culture, so most Chinese Malaysians don't have the instinct to size you up or approach you with any ulterior motives. We're really just happy to get to know you and have a great time. And that's something that I can't say for most Chinese communities. One way I like to put it is that we basically have golden retriever energy. I definitely see that a lot in myself. And honestly, it's one of the things that I've missed the most since moving away from Malaysia. Just how pure interacting with people can be. To me, Chinese Malaysians represent what every overseas Chinese community should strive to be. We've held on to our traditions and language extremely well, while embracing the best parts of the cultures around us. On top of that, we're just friendly, genuine people that can get along with just about anyone in the world. And that's why I'm putting us in S tier. Yes, I'm biased. Feel free to prove me wrong in the comments below. Next up, Chinese-Singaporeans. The Chinese ended up in Singapore for pretty much the same reasons that they did in Malaysia. The main difference here, though, is that before the British colonized Singapore back in the 1800s, it was just a swamp with less than 200 people living on it. That's why today, Singapore has a 75% ethnic Chinese population compared to Malaysia's 20%. The next two biggest ethnic groups are Malays at 15% and Indians at 7%. Ironically, though, despite being the majority population, Chinese Singaporeans are quite disconnected from their Chinese roots. English is by far and away Singapore's main language, and even though most Chinese Singaporeans do learn some Mandarin in school, they can barely speak it, if at all. So it's not a surprise that heritage languages like Hokkien, Teochew, and Cantonese have mostly disappeared as well. This is because Lee Kuan Yew, the man who built Singapore, made English the main language to unify the different ethnic groups that all spoke different languages and turned Singapore into an international business hub. And it worked. Singapore went from a tiny, overcrowded swamp with no natural resources to one of the richest countries in the world. Singaporeans are extremely pragmatic because that's the foundation that their country was built on. But the downside of this, though, is that this is only making them more and more sterile on a cultural level. On top of that, Singapore is the most talent-competitive country, as well as the second densest country on the planet. You're basically competing with some of the smartest people in the world on a tiny island where everyone is trying to get into the same schools and the same jobs. This kind of pressure really pushes people to be materialistic and hyperfixate on stuff like academic and career achievement, so it's no surprise that Singaporeans don't really have the energy to think about stuff like language or cultural identity. Yet despite all that, I still find Chinese Singaporeans to be quite easygoing. I mean, they're definitely not as warm as Chinese-Malaysians, not by a long shot, but I've been able to get along quite well with most of the Chinese Singaporeans I've met. It also helps that we have a very similar cultural background. And again, because Singapore is one of the world's biggest international hubs, most Singaporeans are quite open-minded towards foreign cultures as well. I will say that because Singapore is one of the richest countries in the world, some Singaporeans might look down on other poorer countries in Asia, for example. So that's a slight minus. This was a tough choice to make, but I feel like I have to put Chinese Singaporeans in B tier. Sorry guys. Chinese Americans. Now there's a lot less I can generalize here because Chinese Americans can be quite diverse. Not only do they come from more places in China, there can also be differences between a 6th-generation Chinese American whose ancestors came in the 1800s and someone who has immigrant parents, for example. Not to mention that where you grew up in the US can completely change the way you'll turn out as a person. I've only ever lived in New York during my time in the States, and of course, the vast majority of Chinese Americans there are either 1st or 2nd generation. They tend to stick very closely to themselves and other East Asians. Most friend groups are completely East Asian. A lot of them only date other East Asians, and you'll usually find them hanging out in places like K-Town, Chinatown, or Flushing. I also find it weird that so many of them have the exact same set of hobbies. It feels like everyone likes playing games like Valorant, and it feels like everyone likes going to raves. What I find interesting though is that despite centering so much of their identity on being Chinese or Asian, they actually have quite a fragile connection to their heritage. You know, growing up in Malaysia, it's completely normal to joke about race, whether that be other people's race or your own, and no one takes it personally because it's all in good fun. But this is something that I can't do around Chinese Americans or any other type of Asian American because they're so sensitive about this kind of stuff. And I get it. If you grew up in a place like America where you could get bullied for how you look or how smelly the food you brought to school is, you don't really have the chance to develop a strong sense of self that would allow you to actually enjoy humor like that. I guess it's kind of like someone making fun of your insecurities, but still, imagine getting policed on what you can or can't say about Asians, your own people, by someone that can't even speak a single Asian language and has no idea what living in Asia is actually like. I don't know, man. Am I wrong to be annoyed at this? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, even though I can't relate to Chinese Americans in certain ways, and I'm not the biggest fan of how reluctant they are to socialize with people who don't look like them, most of them are actually quite fun to be around. Because of the American influence, I also find Chinese Americans to be quite extroverted relative to other Chinese communities. And that is something that I like because that corresponds to my personality as well. Not to mention that they also have the wittiest sense of humor out of all the communities on this list. Therefore, Chinese Americans get a solid A on the tier list. Taiwanese. Taiwanese people are by far the most polite and mindful out of all the communities on this list, and I'd say that they're just as friendly, if not friendlier than Chinese-Malaysians. Taiwan was a Japanese colony for 50 years, and still to this day they have very close ties to Japan, so one way I like to put it is that they somehow managed to absorb all the good traits from Japanese culture while leaving out all the bad ones, like the extreme repression, the hierarchy, and the closed-mindedness. So all of this niceness that you experience from Taiwanese people, you know for sure that it's 100% genuine every single time. Similar to Japanese women, Taiwanese women can be very bubbly, but unlike with Japanese women, you never get the feeling that Taiwanese women could be putting on an act or faking it. You know what I'm saying? There is a slight downside to this though. Because most Taiwanese people are so soft and so non-confrontational, I've seen them getting bullied a lot when they live abroad and they have to deal with roommates from a different culture, for example. And even in Taiwan, they can get bullied by people from mainland China. And that's something I'll get into later on in the video as well. What I also think is cool about Taiwanese people is that they've been able to preserve their heritage language extremely well, which is called Hokkien, but people also call it Minnan, or just Taiwanese. There's a global trend of Chinese heritage languages dying out with each new generation because of how standardized Mandarin has become. But I feel like this is way less of a thing in Taiwan because it seems like people care a lot about keeping the Taiwanese language alive. Almost every Taiwanese person my age that I've met still speaks it, and I even know some that have actively taken Taiwanese classes just because they care that much. And since we're on the topic of language, even though Taiwanese people are one of the weakest when it comes to speaking English among the different Chinese communities, they're still incredibly welcoming and curious when it comes to foreigners and foreign cultures. And to me, that says a lot about their nature. And for all of these reasons, Taiwanese people definitely deserve to get put in S tier. Next up, Hong Kongers. I want to like Hong Kongers so bad because I love Cantonese. I consumed a lot of Hong Kong media growing up, and I really admire how fiercely Hong Kongers protect their identity against influence from mainland China. But still, there's just a couple of things about Hong Kongers that don't sit right with me. First of all, I don't like how snappy a lot of Hong Kongers can be. They can be very impatient and brutally honest, so they're definitely not afraid to say things that would be considered very mean in other cultures. This is less of a problem with the younger generation, but still, I never really feel a level of warmth from them like I do with Chinese-Malaysians or Taiwanese people, for example. Their sense of humor is also built entirely around roasting people, and even though I do find it funny a lot of the time, it does get exhausting being around that kind of negativity. They're also very cutthroat because they live in one of the densest places in the world. Even though Hong Kong is technically less dense than Singapore, the city planning and infrastructure is nowhere near as good, so you just feel even more cramped and stressed, and maybe that's why Singaporeans are more easygoing compared to Hong Kongers, despite living in a denser city. Because of this environment, a lot of Hong Kongers are also a bit obsessed with money and status, which I'm not the biggest fan of. And there's also the rampant racism towards brown people. There's a lot of Indians living in Hong Kong, and a lot of Hong Kongers refer to them as ata, and this literally translates to inferior. A lot of Hong Kongers say this so unapologetically, which is crazy to me. And at the same time, there's a very clear juxtaposition between this and the admiration that they have for Western cultures and white foreigners. In general though, Hong Kongers aren't the most curious or friendliest bunch when it comes to other cultures, and I actually find them to be quite cliquey. All that being said, because I do speak Cantonese, it's not hard for me to connect at some level with most of the Hong Kongers that I meet, and even though I'm not the biggest fan of how they express themselves, I still find it interesting to hang out with them most of the time. Therefore, I'm gonna have to put Hong Kongers in B tier. Last but not least, mainland Chinese. Just to give you a general idea of how I feel about them, think about the negative things I just said about Hong Kongers, and it's basically a worse version of that and more. I will preface this by saying that there are a lot of mainland Chinese people that are normal, chill, and open-minded, and I've been fortunate to meet quite a few of them. But with a population of more than 1.4 billion people, it's also extremely common to run into someone that displays the qualities I'm about to mention. On average, they're definitely the most narrow-minded people on this list, and because of that, they're also the least adaptable when they go abroad. They stick exclusively to other mainland Chinese, they insist on using WeChat for everything, and oftentimes they'll refuse to learn the local language and socialize with the locals. And this is an issue even in Asia. Like, there's a reason why mainland Chinese people don't have the best reputation in Malaysia and Singapore, for example, even though those places have major ethnic Chinese populations themselves. I guess this is a consequence of their education system focusing so much on shoving things down their throat. I mean, if you constantly get told what to do and how to think growing up, it's not a surprise that you'd struggle immensely to adapt anywhere else where things are done differently. And I can't overstate how much their education brainwashes them into believing that China is the best at everything, that Taiwan belongs to them, which makes a lot of them bully every Taiwanese person they meet. And I've seen this happen time and time again. Like, if you want a good example of this, just look at what happened during the 2024 Olympics. Because of this superiority complex and entitlement that gets instilled into a lot of them, it's no surprise to me when clips like these go viral.
国际航班的人连中文最基本的中文都不会讲，讲不明白，他为什么做什么服务行业？请问，他一直给我标中文，标英文。我说我是 low English speed low English China， 讲中文，他能不能解决问题？为什么让我不能飞？你今天给我一个合理的解释，给不了都别飞了。恢复现在会讲中文的，刚刚为什么没有一个讲中文的人过来？明明很简单的一个事情。先不要激动。
All East Asian cultures are superficial to varying degrees, but I feel like mainland Chinese culture takes it to a dystopian level. It's so common to see girls from China plastering their faces with foundation to make themselves look as pale as possible. Meanwhile, the actual color of their skin is like 3 shades darker. It's also kind of normal for people in China to alter their appearance with these beauty filters on social media. And by the way, it's literally standard practice in China to have any professional headshot heavily edited. If you know someone from China, ask them to show you their headshot. And I guarantee that most of the time, you won't even recognize them. It's also very common to see them taking really elaborate photo shoots when they travel, even on crowded streets and in museums, with no consideration for the people around them. And I'm like, are appearances and showing off on social media really that much more important than just enjoying the actual experience itself? Not to mention how obsessed they are with name brands and designer clothing. Like, if you've seen how these international Chinese students dress, you know what I'm talking about. On average, they're probably the most materialistic people on the planet. Having said all of that, I've never lived in China, so my perspective is completely skewed towards the mainland Chinese people that are traveling or studying abroad, and I know that this is not the best representation of the country in general. It's very likely that I'd have a lot more positive things to say if I actually spent a year in China. So even with all the negative things I had to say, don't let it stop you from traveling to China and connecting with the people there. Like, you'd probably have a great time. But based on my own experiences so far, unfortunately, I'm gonna have to put the mainland Chinese in C tier. So there goes my ranking of all the major Chinese communities. I try my best not to spread any negativity with my channel, but I do have to keep it real, so if I upset you, I'm sorry, but those were just my honest observations. In any case, feel free to let me know in the comments below whether you agree with me or disagree with me, and I'm always looking forward to reading what you guys have to say. You can watch these videos right here if you're interested in this kind of content, and until next time, have a great rest of your day. Bye guys, love you.